Hello, and welcome to the Bad Spot. I am still enjoying my season break, but I'm back once again with a little bit of Ironsworn content for you to enjoy, whilst also appeasing the algorithm. And this week I am joined once again by the wonderful Steve Morrison of the equally wonderful Errant Adventures podcast. Hi Steve, how are you doing?
Hello, hello. I'm doing great. How are you, Matt?
Doing alright, considering, and this is just, you can't see me, but I'm gesturing to everything that's going on in the world. But yeah, it's fine. This week, I wanted to talk about how solo gaming, and in particular Ironsworn, because that's our general vibe, can really help improve your skills as a GM, no matter what the system is. But now I recommend Ironsworn to everybody. I don't know if you find yourself being a kind of cheerleader for this game as well, Steve, but I definitely do.
Absolutely. I love Ironsworn. I think it is phenomenal, of course, because of Starforged and, your season, my season. But I do think that it is a perfectly encapsulated solo game that you can just present to someone and hopefully with some tips get them on the path to solo role playing. And as I've gone on to play other games solo and use emulators and other oracles and stuff like that, while I enjoy those things, I always come back to Ironsworn as my gold standard of solo role playing.
The reason I wanted to do this video is because my instant thought the moment I played Ironsworn for the first time was the actual idea of playing a solo game by myself. Just the concept was odd and I didn't know what it would feel like. But as soon as I started playing, I was like, oh, wow. And I just felt like I was kind of holding a mirror up to myself as a player and a GM. And as a result, it made me think about everything I was doing in more detail. And I think that if you're doing that, then I think that you reconsider your role at the table, whether you're kind of in front of the screen or behind the screen.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting avenue with solo gaming because, as you mentioned, you're both running the game and playing the game, where you do really have to have both of those roles in your mind at the same time, and you're focusing on one thing, and then you're kind of switching over from that player mode to that game master mode and back and forth. And I mean, that's really one of my favorite parts of the game because I do actually enjoy running games for my friends. And when I'm running games, I'm always kind of a fan of the players and the characters, which is super important, I think. I'm not a very adversarial GM, but I've definitely found that when I'm running a game for myself in a solo setting, that I tend to be more hard on myself. And I think that's because I'm getting a little bit of that bleed over from my player brain of like, well, if I'm not suffering and struggling to overcome difficulties, then am I really doing this right? Am I really playing this game right? And that's, for me, oftentimes too, a little bit more of a fictional writing mindset of I want to put my characters through the ringer before they get to the other side. And then I go back to that game mastering side of my brain and like, okay, well, now I need to throw my character a bone to get them out of this situation that oftentimes the dice have gotten me into. And all of a sudden I'm bouncing back and forth between these two sides where I'm running the game. I'm trying to give my characters ways out of this difficult situation they're in. And then I'm sliding back into the player role and just struggling against that terrible, terrible outcome that I just rolled on the dice.
It's interesting that you mentioned kind of being an adversarial GM. I'm very lucky that I think in my entire role playing game career, it's not a career, is it? In my experience of playing role playing games, I've never really bumped up against an adversarial GM. I've never really felt like they were going for a TPK every time. Do you think that if an adversarial GM were to play Ironsworn, they would be much harder on their character, or it would make them see the error of their ways? And I say the error of their ways, but I think that's just kind of like my own personal preference. That the GM is a player at the table; it's not the enemy. And I think that if I felt like if I was an adversarial GM and I sat down to play Ironsworn, that would be the first thing that I noticed. That like, oh my god, I don't have to try and kill everyone around the table.
I wonder if someone who had a little bit more of an adversarial style as a game master, because I sort of, despite my saying that I wasn't adversarial, or that I'm not an adversarial GM, I had this same experience when I first played Ironsworn, which is I sat down and I was like, okay, I failed on this roll, so I'm going to hammer myself with some mechanical consequences, because that's what happens when you make an attack roll in D&D against a player character and you get a hit, which would in this case be a miss in Ironsworn, since all the dice are very lovely all put together in one roll. You deal damage, you do effects to that character. And so I think, and maybe this may not be adversarial or not adversarial, this may just be the more like traditional style of gaming. When you come into Ironsworn, I think oftentimes you have that initial feeling of like, I need to make this hurt because I failed. And I wonder if an adversarial GM coming into that situation might just burn out on Ironsworn and might just kill their character and be like, well, that wasn't any fun, which could lead to some different opinions on game mastering for groups, but could also just lead to I played the game right. I must need to play it better next time in order to overcome these mechanical consequences. I don't know.
No, I think that's 100% fair. I also feel like in the best experiences I've had in group play in kind of other role playing games is where when I've GM'd is when the players have kind of taken ownership of the consequences of the roles and things. And I started playing role-playing games using the Genesis system, which you and I kind of talked about before, and it's very much like you roll and kind of look at the tea leaves and kind of interpret the answers of what on earth this baffling array of symbols might mean. And I think the best experiences I've had, and the kind of the rule set encourages this, is you roll the dice, and it's not all on the GM to just say, this is what's happening, this is what's going on, this is what this means. Everyone around the table has ownership of the results. And it's up to the GM to kind of guide that. And I think that, especially in co-op Ironsworn play, that's a really amazing thing that I think playing a co-op campaign as someone who is GM'd a lot, you kind of find yourself having to take your hands off the wheel a lot and not just instantly describing the room that people walk into. And I have found personally in games that I've GM'd since playing Ironsworn that I'm asking players a lot more questions, which invests them in the setting and the surroundings, that perhaps in a more traditional GM setup, you just bore them with 5 minutes of details of what everything was like. You described every detail of the room and then expect them to be interested or remember all that stuff. Whereas, if you throw it over to them, once you've kind of set the framework out, your players become more and more invested in the reality in which they're playing.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I love that aspect of solo gaming and relying on oracles for prompts for us as solo players, and then translating that into gaming and being able to throw to your players who are essentially acting as the oracles, because having other minds at the table, you have other experiences, other interests, and you are able to mine those for the really interesting gems of storytelling that can come out when you engage with a table or an oracle when you're solo gaming and you get that prompt in it and it hits something subconscious. When you're playing with a group, you get that same hit off of throwing it to the players, especially, like you said, because they become more invested. It's almost like a snowball effect where the more invested they become, the more excited they are when you throw a question to them because they're like, oh, I know, I've got the best thing for this. And all of a sudden, it's not you telling a story to your friends, it is your table sharing this story together.
And it always makes me think of, I don't know if you saw it, but there was kind of like a viral tweet kind of earlier this year where a GM basically said that he kind of imagined a situation where his table arrived at some ball or some gala, and he asked one of the players, one of the waiters is carrying around a tray of your favorite canapes. What is it? And I was like, that seems kind of pretty basic. But what I was horrified to read in the responses was people like, that's the GM's job. I shouldn't have to be describing anything. Like, I'm already invested in like, thinking about what my character would do in this situation. I mean, I don't know who's playing these games, but it's like Daniel Day-Lewis is like just so invested in all this backstory and preparation they've been doing. But like, it's wild to me that more GMs don't do things like that, which, like, I don't know what all of my characters' favorite things are. That seems to me like a perfectly logical thing to ask someone, and then all of a sudden they've got it and they work their character into the scene all of a sudden. And again, it's about having agency for the players and not just being sat there and told what's happening and then, okay, roll some dice and, make a move or whatever.
Yeah. And I do wonder if some of that hesitance to seize some of that narrative control is because of the sort of structure of traditional role-playing games that have historically had that very clear delineation between the game master and the players. And like, because we hear this all the time, even now, like, well, you're playing in the game master's world. And this is a fallacy that I've fallen into of like, oh, this is my world and my story that I'm telling. And it's not. Like, it might be my world from the standpoint that I originated some of the ideas. But if I'm not taking ideas from my players when they come up with cool stuff and weaving that into the fabric of this world, like, what's the point? Why are we doing this? I could go write a novel by myself and, be totally happy with that. And that is something that I'm actually super excited about because of the last year that I've been doing errant adventures and playing solo pretty much every week for the last year. I have not done a whole lot of game mastering for a group in the last year. And so I'm excited as my group is kind of coming back together and we're starting to play a game together, and it is in a setting that I have created, but I no longer have the mentality of this is my setting. It is now, when we bring it to the table, it is our setting. And they have already introduced things to it that I'm like, I probably would never have thought of that. I don't know that I like that, but okay, sure. Like, it's now part of the world because all of the other players at the table are excited about it. And because of that excitement, it is making the game more engaging and fun for everyone at the table.
Do you think, I know you said you haven't run much games for other people, do you think that having now run solo for a year, you would approach prep differently? And I kind of asked that because, like, I ran a very kind of short, I think it was like 2 episodes of the old Star Wars RPG for my friends during lockdown, and it was like having played Ironsworn pretty much exclusively, and I just kind of turned up on the day and was like, cool, let's just play. And whereas before, like, I think about the campaign that I started running when I was first starting to GM games, kind of like, 5-6 years ago, and it was pretty much like I had written a novel and then just thrown it over to those guys to actually participate in it every now and then. And I keep thinking, man, they must have been so bored. But like now, I don't think I would ever go into doing another RPG as a GM with zero prep. But I think that Ironsworn gives you a lot of confidence. And especially if you've played a lot of Ironsworn and solo, a lot of confidence to maybe just like trust the process a bit more and trust the table a bit more.
Yeah, I would say I mean I've been GMing for probably 10, 11 years. I've been playing RPGs since about 2005. Mm-hmm. And I think the first time I GM'd like a 1 or 2 sessions in that time for some of the friends that introduced me to the game. And then it was probably in like 2009, 2010 when I really started up a like longer running campaign and started GMing. And my relationship with game prep has really shifted over the years and has fluctuated a lot where there have been times where I've been like, cool, I'm going into this with zero prep. I'm just going to make it all up on the fly. Like, I got this. And that usually crashes and burns pretty well. And then there have been days where I'm like, all right, I'm going to sit down for 10 hours and I'm going to plot out this entire session beat for beat, and I'm going to write a document that has bullet points of like every step that the players are going to do, because I know my players and I know that they're going to do this stuff. And like, quite honestly, I don't have the time to do that, mm-hmm. nor the inclination to spend that much energy prepping stuff anymore. And I definitely, my relationship to prep is trending back towards that zero prep or at least minimal prep. And this game that I'm starting to run for my friends is actually the game that we were going to start recording in March of 2020, right after we bought all of our audio equipment, and that got put on hold for a while. And during that time, while I was prepping for that, I had written out a like 13, 14 episode like season arc for this podcast that we were going to do. And I was struggling over with, all right, I've got this all diagrammed out. Here are my characters. Here are the arcs of their story that I want to tell. So I'm going to slot this in on this episode, and I'm going to have this thing happen on this episode. And I was just ramming my head against all this prep for this show that we were going to do. And then thankfully, we did not start that show. And I had the next year and a half to play solo role-playing games and discover the joy of oracles and random tables and interpreting prompts on the fly. And here's a little exclusive for you. We recorded our first episode about 3 weeks ago, and I came to that episode with that little bit of prep that I had gotten for that first episode. But it was basically just a little bit of like information. It was a little story beats, and everything else that happened was all based on oracle rolls and prompts on tables and throwing it to the players. And I was like, we got done with that session, and I was just like, I'm not prepping anything else for the rest of this show. Like, I'm going to think about where the story's going and what complications might come in. But I'm going to sit down at a recording and I'm going to let the dice fall. I'm going to ask the players questions. I did this a couple times in that episode where I turned to a player and I said, roll a couple, like roll your percentile dice. And you've got a 26 or greater for something to happen. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. Just go ahead and roll the dice. And they rolled the dice and, that thing either happened or didn't happen. And it was like, they were like, but what's happening? And I'm like, well, I'm just going to ask the Oracle because I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. And we're going to see. We're going to see what happens together. And so I think having the last year dedicated to running solo games and using all of those tools that I should have known about before, but for some reason didn't, has now opened my eyes to game mastering and just having these random tables around and being able to roll on them and be like, cool, this is what happens. This is the prompt. And this is the connection that my brain makes. So we're going to roll with it.
I think it's one of the tenets of the Powered by the Apocalypse system, isn't it? That you play to find out what happens. And Ironsworn is perhaps the freest expression of that, because when you sit down to play solo, you make your character, you establish your truths, and you set the scene of where you're going to begin, and then I did, and I'm sure other people did, they sat down straight away and was like, okay, so what now? And it's like, well, you play to find out what happens. You're like Indiana Jones in The Last Crusade. You just take the step off the cliff and hopefully there'll be a poorly animated CGI bridge to hold you up. But yeah, so I think that's you're when you were telling me about you'd planned out 14 episodes of content for your, I very nearly had an anxiety attack whilst you were describing that to me, because I think it was such an easy pitfall to fall into.
And I was having that anxiety attack every day of like thinking about this stuff and trying to basically be a writer's room of a TV show and script it out for an unscripted activity. And I was driving myself mad. And, there are a few things that I'm thankful for when it comes to a going on 3-year global pandemic, but it stopped me from making a huge mistake when it came to playing this game with my friends that I think would have eventually flamed out and fallen apart, because I think they would have eventually been like, what are we doing here? Like, it feels like everything is all planned out and we're just on the railroad. And I never wanted to be that, but I also wanted to tell a compelling story. And at that point, I thought that in order to tell a compelling story, I had to know where it was going to make it compelling. And I think the biggest joy that I discovered in the year that I've been doing solo role-playing games is having that aha moment where you're playing along, you roll a prompt, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, that thing that happened 12, 15, 20 episodes ago that just kind of fell by the wayside, it now makes sense. And then you're able to, as you like to say, join the dots and just bring it all back together. And you're just like, it happened. And your subconscious, it wants to put those things together. It wants to make those connections. And so if you give it a little bit of encouragement with some of those prompts and random oracle rolls, then your mind wants to tell a compelling story. You want to put together interesting bits and bobs. And if you let it, your mind, your subconscious, and those prompts can really throw your story into interesting places that are much, much more fascinating to follow than anything that you could have planned out from the beginning.
Yeah, 100%. I also think, and this comes from, obviously you and I have both played for a while now and recorded it for posterity and for everyone to kind of watch or listen to. But I definitely think that even if you just journaled your Ironsworn games, I feel like that process encourages you to be more descriptive, to create a more atmospheric game. And I feel like when I started doing that, my first Ironsworn game just took place in kind of a notebook. I just wrote down what happened, and I didn't want to just write, I walked to this village, I met this person. I wanted to make it sound interesting and cool, and like no one was going to read it, but like, you know, I wanted to add something to it. I didn't want it just to be bullet points of what my character was doing. And that instantly made me think like, oh man, when I'm GMing, do I do this all the time? Do I skate over details? Do I bring the world to life enough for my players? And from my point of view, I definitely didn't. I definitely think that as soon as I strayed off my preconceived track of where I thought the story would go, or the kind of, as soon as we got to the edges of what I had already planned and kind of stepped off that kind of trail, I got very sketchy with details. And I feel like playing solo almost forces you not to do that. You can't just say, you can't describe, you know, a passage of a dungeon in great detail because you've thought about it, and then when your players get distracted, as they want to do, by some trivial bullshit somewhere else, you can't just say, okay, well, you go down this corridor and you walk through this door and then you're in another room and then, you know, you see a monster or whatever. Like, and I've done that many times when I've been forced off my preconceived notion of what's going to happen. I really just kind of fudge it. And I feel like when playing solo, I caught myself doing it loads and instantly kind of tried to like, okay, right, stop. What are we doing here? And actually being more descriptive and trying to bring it to life more effectively, even if it's just for your own volition or your own kind of notebook or whatever. I feel like playing solo definitely encourages you to be more descriptive and to try and bring that world to life in much more detail.
Yeah, I think also having the access to all of the oracle tables and prompt tables. I used to do this because I've always struggled with description, even in my writing. My writing tends to be very description light. And, you know, I like to keep things quickly paced and moving along. And I found that the same in my game mastering as well, that it would just be like, boom, 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 here we go. We're getting to the action. And then people would be like, wait, what's in this room? Where are we? What's going on? And it's like, oh, yeah, I guess there is actually stuff in here. And one of the things that I started to do to try and mitigate that a little bit was just keep a list of like sense words for sight and sound and smell available to me in my like game mastering binder that I could just look at every once in a while and be like, oh, you know, you smell petrichor, you know, or like all these different things. And I didn't know it at the time because that was pre-solo gaming, but like that was a proto random table for me of sense words that would help prompt me to envision the area. And I do love that about Ironsworn, that envision is a word that is so integral to the game, of like envision what happens, envision what's around, because I don't do that all that often. I'm not a very like mentally visual person. And so it did actually make me stop and go, okay, I've got to close my eyes now and picture this room that these characters are in. And just having those additional tables that you can roll on that give you little prompts about, you know, I think of like original Ironsworn has the table for like land features. And so, okay, you roll on that. Oh, there's a river. Cool. You know, maybe you roll on, you know, action and theme or whatever, and it gives you some combination of words, and you're like, okay, so this is, not only is it a river, but it is some combination of noun and verb that you can then interpret to add to your description of that river that you see, that brings it to life.
Yeah. And it also helps just one detail, like using your example of the river, like, oh, I'm going to a settlement. What's the detail? It's on a river. Why did they build it next to this river in particular? Is there a ford there? Is there a ford that goes across the river to another settlement? Is that settlement a rival settlement? What's their beef? Like, all of a sudden you've got this cascade of ideas that just comes from one detail, which is a river. I really love, like you said, how in Ironsworn it's like literally the first thing you do after you resolve the role, envision what happens and take +2 momentum or whatever. You have to. You can't just say, "Oh, I succeeded, my stats go up." You have to put thought into, what does this look like? What does this success or failure or mixed success look like, and how does it feel to my characters?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I absolutely need all of the time and that heartbeat where you just take that extra perspective. It can enrich your game so much, and that's something that I need. It's something that I need to do, in all of my games, because it is sometimes a challenge to come up with those descriptive imaginings, that envisioning of what is around you, and just having that moment, giving yourself permission to take that moment to envision what's around you, definitely can make your game breathe and really enrich the experience, whether you're doing solo gaming or playing with a group.
Yeah. And that's the wonderful thing about like co-op Ironsworn as well, is you envision something, and then that gets thrown over to the other person or the other people around the table. Like, we turn down this corridor. Oh, it's got a really low ceiling. Okay, well, right, are we on our hands and knees then? Yeah. And then someone's like in front. Oh, I can smell a trail of blood like leading off into another room. All of a sudden, one idea is then kind of snowballs with, just by being kind of battered around the table for like 2 or 3 sentences, can get you an awful lot of mileage. So I think we've agreed Ironsworn is the greatest RPG of all time. And I have titled this video, Ironsworn will make you a better GM. That's a guarantee. And if it doesn't make you a better GM, then I'll leave Shawn Tompkins' contact details in the description down below. You can take it out with him.
You can get your money back for that free PDF, that feature complete, wonderfully designed game that is just completely free on the internet.
Yeah. He's processing all the refunds every day from disappointed people who are now not better GMs, who are upset that they asked a character around their table to describe a canapé, and it spiraled out of control. But yeah, I think we've kind of pretty much made a decent case for that, don't you think? I
think so. Go play Ironsworn and then GM better. Just do it. Just GM better.
Yeah, absolutely. Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, no worries. I think we might find time for another chat in my season break. Depends. It's getting up to Christmas now, but we'll make every effort to do so. I'll be back next time, I'm going to say. I'm not going to say next week, because that might be too much of a commitment for me to fulfill. But until next time, it is farewell.
And safe passage.